Hello there and welcome to Lesson 4. This lesson is called Fake News Analysis because this lesson primarily focuses on what you need to do to write your first major paper for the course, which is due in a couple of weeks. And, as you can tell from the title, that paper is very similar to what I asked you to do in the Lesson 3 discussion board post. That post was really like practice for the upcoming paper. Talk more in detail about that throughout the lecture, but primarily you're going to be doing a fake news analysis for your first major paper. The reason this is the focus of Lesson 4 is that one of my main goals as an instructor is transparency. This manifests in two main ways. One, I want to be as clear as possible about what I'm asking you to do for each and every assignment, especially the major assignments. So I devote an entire lecture to going over that assignment, going over student samples, going over how to structure your paper, going over my writing tips, setting you up for as much success as possible on your papers. Thus, like I said, transparency. There's no tricks, no gimmicks with me. What you see is what you get. I want what you see to be as clear as possible. The second part of transparency is that I also want to make really clear why I'm asking you to do what I'm asking you to do, the reason, the rationale behind it. I'll talk more about that throughout the lecture, but that's why every major assignment I give you has a section of it called purpose. And like I said, we'll talk more about that. So the overview of this lesson, we're going to do three things. First, we're going to look at the actual assignment prompt. So what you see on Canvas when you go to the assignment for the first major paper. We won't cover that in every minute detail. I'll just go over kind of the main part of it to make sure you understand really clearly what I'm asking you to do for the assignment. This portion of the lecture would simulate in a face-to-face class what I would do when I put, say, the assignment prompt on the screen, hand you out copies of it, and go over it as a class, answer your questions. It's meant to simulate that kind of introduction to the assignment, again, to be as clear and as transparent as possible about what I'm asking. Secondly, we'll talk about structuring your paper and the required reading this week on Canvas. I've posted two documents. One is on structuring individual paragraphs. The second one is on structuring the entire paper. Hopefully you find those handouts helpful. But in part 2, sorry for the typo there, it should say part 2, not part 3. Part 2 of this lecture, I will go over that document, both those documents, the paragraph and the whole paper. And then we'll also look at a student sample paper, plugging in examples such as thesis statements, transition sentences, etc., so that when I'm talking about this type of sentence or this type of paragraph from the handout, you have a student example, which I've also assigned as required reading for this lesson, to see that type of thing illustrated well by the student. Finally, and again, this should say part 3, not 2, writing tips. So just real quick to end the lecture, my tips. These are the tips that I've learned through years of doing a lot of writing and primarily doing a lot of writing very poorly and receiving feedback from teachers, instructors, mentors on how to improve my writing. These are the things after years of writing poorly that I use now that help me the most whenever I have to write something important. And these will be useful on this upcoming assignment, but also more generally, you could take them with you to other classes, any writing task you have, and they would help you. Once again, as in lesson 3, overall, this lesson is not too terribly long, I hope. So I'm not breaking it up into separate videos. I'm going to try to move through each part pretty darn quickly. Also, one other thing to mention, I have not devoted any slides to the rough draft peer review portion. We will talk about what that is and why we do it. But in terms of the mechanics of it, turning it into doing it, it's very straightforward. So at the end of lesson 4, you have your rough draft due. And if you turn that into Canvas on time, the Monday after it is due, Canvas will randomly assign you 3 peer review partners from our class. At 1 p.m., if you go back to the assignment page, the rough draft assignment page, after 1 p.m., the day after the rough draft is due, you'll see your 3 partners' names on the right-hand side of that Canvas assignment page. Click on their name, it takes you to their paper. There you can give them feedback, and there's instructions on how to give them feedback. Make sure to do that by the Friday after the rough draft was due so that they can have 2 full days or more to incorporate your feedback into their paper. So that's all pretty clearly laid out on Canvas. So I just cover it real briefly now. If you have any questions about that or anything else, just send me a message, come to my office hours, we'll figure it out. All right, so like I said, this first assignment is a fake news analysis. I've got J. Jonah Jameson, great performance by one of my favorite actors from Spider-Man Far From Home, where he's just spewing lies about Spider-Man, totally making stuff up to discredit Spider-Man and turn the public against him. I mean, this is really one of the main reasons why I showed you Spider-Man Far From Home in lesson 2. Hopefully it makes very vivid to you the danger of fake news and why this assignment is relevant and important. But in addition to showing you what I'm expecting on the assignment, how to do it, I do want to spend some time explaining why this assignment is important and relevant, why I've chosen it for your first major assignment in 201. But sometimes a picture says 1,000 words. I really do believe that. Even though I'm an English major and teacher, I'm very much a believer in the power of visuals. And I think this one might say anything more better than I could for the purpose and rationale of this assignment. Before we get into the specific assignment instructions, I want to go over the different parts of the assignment sheet or assignment page on Canvas because there's several different components. I want you to know what is most important, be able to find things easily, know why they're there so that you don't get lost in what is kind of a long assignment sheet. Task is in some ways the most important part in terms of just doing the assignment because it's telling you in a few short sentences what I'm asking you to do. Purpose is probably the most important part of the assignment sheet because there I'm telling you why we're doing these things. Audience, talk more about that later, but audience is very important. Who you should think of as your reader while you write. That's also in the writing tips section of this lecture, but that is one of the best pieces of advice I can give you is to think of who will be reading this while you write it. And in a 201 class, you could say we're simulating an audience. The audience should be more than just your classmates and me. We'll talk about why in a few slides, but think of an audience as you write, and that's so important. Thinking of others, writing for others, not yourself, that is actually a section of the assignment sheet. Requirements, this is just the most basic nuts and bolts. How long should it be? What kind and how many sources do I need to include? What format should it be in? So really boring stuff, but you can quickly glance at that and know these important details about the specifics, how long it should be, etc. Finally, the criteria for success is my term for a rubric. So that's basically a checklist of everything that needs to go in the paper. In there, those are very short sentences, almost like bullet points, but they do explain, that you need a thesis, etc. So that's a great checklist for you as you prepare your final draft. All right, let's talk specifically about what I'm asking you to do in this paper. I say compose a fake news analysis of a news article you find online. So in just one sentence, most simply put, that's what I'm asking you to do. That's why it's the first sentence of the assignment prompt. But what do I mean by that? First of all, you can use any news article you want. So it doesn't really matter. It can be something really credible and reliable. It can be some kind of weird, crazy conspiracy website. It can be anything in between on that spectrum. Whatever you want to analyze, the goal is to get some practice analyzing media to be able to tell whether it's credible and reliable. And what does that look like in writing a paper? Make an argument about whether the information in the article is credible and reliable. So clue in on that phrase there, make an argument. That can be your thesis. Make an argument. Whenever you read that phrase, that means you're taking a stance. So it can be as simple as the information in fill in the blank article is credible because give the reason why. That can be your thesis. What do you then do in the course of the paper? Analyze specific examples from the article to support your stance. What do I mean when I say specific examples? A few things. Obviously, the actual language of the article. So quote the article itself and analyze those quotes. Usually, when students use news sources as sources in papers for my classes, I say to paraphrase, because when you paraphrase, you show that you understand the idea clearly in your own words. And I mention this now because people in this class have had courses with me before and have heard me say that. Here, quoting the article will be very important because you're making a claim about whether it's credible or not. So the way it uses language can be part of that. It might be very credible because it uses a certain type of neutral language, or it might be unreliable because it's trying to manipulate you and the language is part of that. So analyzing quotes from the article can be an example. Another one could be visuals. Since these articles are probably online that you're finding, many of them will be using visuals. That can be, they can really manipulate people through visuals, or visuals can give credibility if you're taking the other kind of stance. Finally, you can investigate the sources, which is part of SIFT. And in a minute, I'll talk about how you need to find some additional sources. So if the article quotes sources, which it should, if it's credible or it's attempting to be credible, you can use those sources, investigate those, and talk about those as a way of showing its credibility. I think on the actual assignment sheet, I've tightened up these sentences here so they're more succinct for the PowerPoint. I list out types of examples and I say quotations, visuals, and sources. When I say quotations, I mean you quoting the language of the article itself by its author. Under the broad category of sources, you could also have quotations that the article uses because it might be accurately quoting something else or misrepresenting something else by taking a quote out of context. So in terms of type of examples, keep in mind there's you quoting the article itself, and then there's the things the article quotes. Those both would work, but I want the difference to be clear. And anything I've just listed can be an example. I'm not requiring you to have certain types of examples. As long as you analyze a number of examples to prove your point, that's great. Use the SIFT and CRAP frameworks. So just like we talked about in lesson 3, these can kind of be your guide, and you can structure your paper any number of ways. One would be to pick some of these tools, the letters from SIFT or letters from CRAP, and make those a focus of a paragraph. Like you could focus a paragraph on investigating the sources from the I in SIFT, another paragraph on the reliability from the CRAP framework. But you don't have to do it that way either. And you don't have to address all these as long as you address some of them. You do need to address F, though, as I ask you to find 3 additional sources that provide better or additional coverage. This is for a few reasons. One, it's always good to find sources when you're writing papers in college to support what you're saying as evidence. 2, the F may be the most important part of SIFT or CRAP, because think of it like shining a light. Maybe you're in a dark room, you can't see clearly. That's what it feels like sometimes when we're reading fake news, and then all of a sudden you turn on a light switch, you can see better. Sometimes those other or additional sources are like the light that comes on when you flip the light switch. They help you see the room or the main article you're analyzing better. I say better or additional coverage because you may well be arguing that the main source is very credible. So the additional articles don't have to disprove the claims of the main article. They can show that it is reliable, or they can show that it's not reliable. So technically the F stands for find better coverage, but I'm calling it find better or additional coverage because it can go either way. You can either argue that it's credible or not credible. So this is a lot. So to sum up, 1, you're writing a fake news analysis. 2, your thesis is the source is credible because, or the source is not credible because. The body of your paper, analyze specific examples from the source to prove that claim. Part of that analysis can be the sift and crap tools, and part of that analysis should also be some sources that help illuminate what you're saying about the credibility. Hopefully that all makes sense. Like I've said numerous times, reach out to me with any questions about anything we do, but especially about major assignments like this one. I've talked throughout this lecture about the importance of purpose. It's very important, I think, for instructors to be clear and transparent about what they're asking you to do on assignment, but I also believe it's just as critical, if not more so, for instructors to be clear and transparent about why they're asking you to do something on an assignment. So I always include a purpose statement. This is maybe not as important to just knowing what to do, but in the grand scheme of things, beyond just doing well on this paper, is perhaps most important. Why are we doing this? And so this is important because one way you could think of a class in college like this one as, I have to do the assignment because the professors asked me to do the assignment, and I have to get a good grade in the class so that I pass it and I can graduate. But I believe in my teaching philosophy that professors are much more than gatekeepers or arbiters of grades. There's a real opportunity to learn things here that will be applicable well beyond this class. And so that's one of my goals, is for you to learn actual skills and knowledge that will help you beyond this class. On this particular assignment, the most important thing you'll learn is media literacy. The term literate, as you probably understand, it means to read and write, but to knowing how to read and write. But people have since taken that term literate or literacy and used it to mean having a clear, solid grasp of something. So you might be literate or illiterate in a certain area. So media literacy is knowing how to read, analyze, and interpret media to see if it's telling you the truth or not. People have tried to manipulate people since the beginning of time, but unfortunately in the last 20-some years, as technology has become much more readily available and powerful, people have been able to manipulate people through the media much more easily. And that's why media literacy is such an important part of a class like this one. So that's the most important thing you'll learn, and you could say the main focus of this assignment, but you'll also learn written and visual analysis as you critically dissect the article and delve into its depths to show that you're media literate through this in-depth analysis of this article. That'll also involve synthesis, which is a fancy word for making connections. So as you quote and cite these other sources and say, this source helps us see how the main article is credible or not because, fill in the blank, you're synthesizing multiple things there, making connections between them. And synthesis is one of the most transferable and extendable skills from this class. You'll use synthesis all over the place in the real world. Obviously, critical thinking is a part of analysis and synthesis. And then these last few bullet points have to do with writing as a process. I'll emphasize this even more when we get to the writing tips section at the end of the lecture. But if you learn one thing in this class that's helpful to you beyond it, at least in terms of writing, probably the most important thing is writing as a process. So if you just do a writing project right before it's due, it's not a process. And to truly have success on writing, it needs to be a process because writing is personal. It's hard to be objective, and it's impossible to get right on a single try. So The process involves writing multiple drafts, giving feedback to others, and then receiving feedback from others and incorporating that into your own writing. So that's why we have the rough draft and peer review process I discussed a few minutes ago. Now, you're going to take other classes in college that will ask you to do major writing assignments that are worth a big chunk of your grade, but they're not going to make you turn in multiple drafts or make you do a peer review process. So if you learn this process in this class and it becomes a habit and you just do it on your own without an instructor requiring it, when you do important writing assignments, you will have such great success on writing assignments in future classes. So please use this assignment as an opportunity to learn the writing process and then carry it with you to other writing projects. Finally, let's go over just kind of the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of the paper, how long should it be, etc. So some other important things from the assignment sheet. Choosing a text, any article you want. I mentioned that before. Both the lesson 3 and lesson 4 discussion boards ask you to do stuff that's basically parts of this paper. So if you want to use lesson 3 or lesson 4 discussion board as kind of a starting point in your paper, that's great. Do it. I recommend it. I encourage it. But the rough draft has to be 750 words, and the final draft has to be 1,000 words. In both cases, those all have to be new original work. So even if you have a great discussion board post and you copy it word for word, like verbatim, and kind of add some transitions to make it flow, that just means your paper is going to be longer than the minimum word count, and that's fine. Totally fine. Maybe you really rework it and it's almost different, or it's entirely different, but it helps you get started. That's fine too, as long as the paper is the minimum word count original work. Audience, I mentioned this before. It's time to talk about it in more detail here. When we write, it's a personal thing. It's hard to be objective, but ultimately we have a goal of creating some kind of change through our writing, maybe persuading someone of something, some kind of goal. So the measure of our success as a writer is not personal, even though writing itself is. It's measured by the response and the reader. And if we just write for ourselves, that's very natural, but it doesn't help us achieve our goal. We have to write for others. We have to imagine our audience and have them in mind as we're writing. So what may seem obvious to you will not be obvious to someone who has not been living inside your mind for days or weeks while you've been working on a writing project. So when you write and you reread your drafts, think, how will someone who's never read this paper, doesn't know what I've been thinking about, how will they react? How will they respond to this? If you start doing that, you will grow leaps and bounds as a writer. So I always include an audience on the paper prompt to give you people to imagine, so that you think of more than just me and your classmates, because we would have a hard time being objective as well since we're in the class. So think of people who are, fairly professional and academic. You don't want to use profanity or text speak or anything like that. Avoid the phrases I think, I feel, I believe, in my opinion. Just state your arguments. The first person, I, can be fine in some instances. Just don't say I think, I feel, I believe, or in my opinion. And avoid summary. Summarize a little bit so that general readers can understand what you're saying, but the main focus should be on analysis. You'll have to summarize some to make clear, what your article's talking about, but real briefly, a few sentences here and there. It's easy with this kind of paper to do multiple pages of summary. No, you want a little summary here and there, mostly analysis. If you write for that kind of audience, you'll do really well. Like I said, the rough draft, 750 words, about 3 pages. The final draft, 1,000 words. So adding at least one more page from the rough draft to final draft. I have the minimum for the rough draft so that you don't just turn in an outline or something, so that you can get really good feedback from your partners. The format is MLA. If you have any questions about that, there's a link on the assignment sheet to a resource for MLA format. Include at least 3 secondary sources for the F and SIFT. We talked about that already. These do not have to be scholarly sources. Since you're analyzing a news article, they could be other news articles. They could be popular sources, like the Spider-Man fake news article I included in the last lecture. But avoid things like blogs or social media posts. You want it to be fairly professional, even if it's not peer-reviewed. And mainly it comes down to your analysis and discernment. Is this additional source credible, or does it at least help for some reason shed light on the credibility or lack thereof of the main source you're analyzing? And these are in addition to the main article you're analyzing, so 4 sources total. And then finally, use the criteria for success or the rubric as a checklist. So going from draft to draft, definitely look at this beforehand, but when you're going to that final draft, go down the rubric and make sure you've done all those things. They're short sentences like a checklist, just to make sure you have everything. So that's the assignment sheet in a nutshell. Like I said, reach out to me, with any questions at all, but hopefully this part of the lecture makes clear what I'm asking you to do there. All right, so for part 2, it should say part 2 there, structuring your paper. 2 things here is going over the handouts on both paragraphs and the whole paper. We're actually going to do the whole paper first and then talk about individual paragraphs on the final slide of this part. But another part of this is giving you a student example to look at and see some examples of the types of things I'm talking about. So a quick note on that. This is actually the first quarter that I've taught the fake news analysis. So normally I'd give you at least 3 sample papers of what I'm asking you to do, but I'm trying this out because I think it's really important. I think media literacy with the advent of fake news is more important now than it's ever been. It's absolutely critical to learn in a class like this. Hopefully Spider-Man Far From Home illustrates that point. So I'll probably reach out to some of you at the end of the course and say, hey, can I use your fake news analysis in a future class as an example? Because you did a great job on it. But suffice to say, I don't have any examples here to give you now. So the example I have included is more of just a general analysis paper. It's actually a rhetorical analysis paper from 101 class. That's the best I could do. But it will be helpful in 2 ways. One, it's analysis, so it's a similar type of writing. It's not talking about the credibility or reliability of something, but it is doing a very good deep dive critical reading of a text. So there's some overlap there. And then 2, you could apply it to almost anything because we're talking about thesis statements, transition sentences. While I do want to give you specific help for this immediate paper, the goal here is to, in general, learn how to write thesis statements, topic sentences, transition sentences, etc. So that's a quick note about the specific sample paper I've given you. I want to talk for one last second here about the image I've chosen here. It's incredibly important. Like I said, when you write, you want to be as clear as possible to your writer. So you have to give them signposts. This is one of the best pieces of advice I've ever received on writing. Guide your reader through the paper. Make really clear what you're doing, where you're doing it, and why, so that they can follow your train of thought easily. So think of it like road signs, marking where you're supposed to go. You're guiding the reader through the paper. And on the next slide, we'll talk about several specific types of signposts, specific ways to guide your reader through the paper so that it flows smoothly. So we're going to extend this metaphor of signposting through to structuring the paper, and we're going to go over some important terminology, which are just words to describe types of sentences. When people read your writing, every sentence is important because they may not spend too much time on it. And there's different types of sentences you can write. And if you write sentences a certain way, the reader will clue in to what you're doing and be able to follow your train of thought. We're going to talk about those sentences or those signposts on this slide. So just like traffic lights, street signs, and lines on the road guide cars, our paragraphs and sentences help guide the reader. And if you can execute really well on your sentence design, then the reader will stay within the lines just like a car on the road. They'll flow all the way through your paper, they'll be engaged, and they'll get what you're saying. Maybe you'll even persuade them or create change. You can do that all the way to sentence type can help you do that. So what are some types of sentences? Starting with the thesis statement. It's clear, specific, which means it's a very narrow focus. It takes a position, and it's at the end of the introductory paragraph. You want to take a position. A thesis has to be an argument, a claim. If it's just a fact, it's not debatable, you don't need to write a paper about it. It needs to be clear. Use simple language. Students often, I think, get engaged with a thesaurus in Microsoft Word and try to use big words to impress instructors. I've encountered it a lot. The more simple way you say something, the easier it is to understand. It doesn't matter how educated your audience is. They're not educated on what you're writing about. Even if they're an expert in that field, it's your idea, your argument, your opinion. So say it in the clearest, simplest way possible. Take a position and have a narrow focus. I know it can be easy to worry about how am I going to write all of these things. But if you try to do too much, you lose focus. It's much better to write about one thing or something small in great detail. And I'll help you learn how to do it in more detail, but that'll hold your reader's focus. If you try to cover too much ground, they'll get confused and you'll lose them. Finally, why put the thesis at the end of the introductory paragraph? Signposting. Putting sentences in specific spots can help guide your reader. If the thesis is the first sentence of the paper, they won't know what you're talking about. You need a little context to introduce it. If it's the final sentence of your intro, then the most important sentence of the paper will be the most recent thing your reader remembers when they start reading the rest of the paper. There's 3 other main types of signposts beyond the thesis. The thesis statement itself, which tells the reader what the paper is about. Then 2 more, topic sentences, which are like little mini thesis statements at the start of each paragraph. They need to go at the start of the paragraph so that the reader knows what the paragraph is about. If you wait till the end of the paragraph and build up to your argument, they'll be wondering what you're saying. You start your paper with an intro, some context, end the intro with a thesis. Then each paragraph has a really clear mini thesis. At its beginning, though, the reader will follow your argument in each paragraph. Then you can conclude each paragraph with a concluding sentence that wraps it up nicely so that each paragraph is like a little mini paper and they all work together to prove that bigger thesis that's at the beginning. Finally, transitions. If all of these supporting points, all of these topic sentences from each paragraph truly prove your thesis, then they're interrelated. And if you show those connections, the reader will see why and how we move from one paragraph to the next, and your paper will flow so smoothly, so seamlessly for them. Finally, paragraph breaks signal that the writer is moving from one topic to a new one. Have 3 or 4 supporting topics to prove your thesis and give each one its own paragraph. If you talk about 2 different topics in one paragraph, it'll be confusing. If you talk about one topic and you're still talking about it in the next paragraph, if it's a complex topic, maybe okay. And that's not as bad as doing 2 in 1, but again, your reader will be confused. They'll think you're moving on to something else. So even just where you break the paragraph, not even writing anything, just where you break the paragraph can be a hugely significant signpost for your reader. All right, let's look at these signposts in detail. Thesis statements. Here are the steps to writing a great thesis. State your topic as a question. Because we studied, is Google making us stupid? Couple lessons ago, I'm going to use kind of, and then Clive Thompson, Smarter Than You Think. I'm going to use that as an example here. So if you start with a question, does Google make people less smart or smarter, you can then answer that question. Turn your question into a position. You could say, like Thompson does, Google makes people smarter. Not an ideal thesis statement yet, but you have a position. You have that argument portion of it. For this paper, you could ask, what is the meaning or message of my text? Then you narrow your position. By helping us find information that we used to have to keep stored in our heads, Google makes people smarter. Really more efficient, but that's what Thompson means when he says smarter, is more efficient. So you give a reason, a rationale, and that narrows your position. It makes it specific. This is specifically why Google makes people smarter. Finally, qualify your thesis. By helping us find information that we used to have to keep stored in our heads, Google can make many people smarter. If I just say Google makes people smarter, it sounds like I'm saying it makes all people smarter. The other essay is Google making us stupid has shown that there's a pretty clear counter-argument to the idea that the internet and technology make us smarter. So we qualify it. It makes many people smarter, maybe not all. So start with a question, answer your question, give a reason why, qualify your thesis. You go through these steps, you'll have a great thesis. Let's look at an example from the student paper. The film Django Unchained is a great example of how using race and slavery from creative perspectives can create emotional appeals, along with many historical accuracies to captivate an audience in ways many movies haven't before. So the student is not named Fitzgerald. I just used the names of my favorite football players to make the papers anonymous. Why is this a good thesis? Let's break it into pieces. It has the position. The film Django Unchained is a great example. So the student is taking a stance. The film does something effectively. What does it do? Here's the narrowing the thesis or giving the reason why. Using race and slavery from creative perspectives can create emotional appeals, along with many historical accuracies. So the student is saying the film takes a really unique stance on a difficult topic, and it does it through emotion and historical accuracy. These papers, I should say, because I've asked you to read several student samples, are not meant, as I mentioned before, to be ideal examples or perfect examples. They're just meant to show you some things students do well. Of course, there's things that students also do not do well, because there's no such thing as a perfect paper. But I want you to have illustrations or examples of the concepts I'm talking about. Just like Civil War was an example of critical reading and rhetorical analysis. So I would work on the sentence structure. I think this could actually be said a little more clearly, but you have a clear claim. The film takes a unique perspective on the complex issue of slavery. And how does it do that? Through emotion and history. Those are the two primary rhetorical strategies, you could say. So you need an argument, right? People could say, this is a trash film, it's not good. It doesn't do these things. You've got a position. You also have to have a reason why. Emotional appeals and historical accuracies. How about the second of the three signposts, topic sentences? A topic sentence announces the argument of a paragraph. Good paragraphs focus on a single point. I mentioned that already. And usually the topic sentence begins the paragraph. You might ask, if a paragraph is like a little mini paper and the topic sentence is the thesis of the paragraph, why is it at the beginning of the paragraph? Because I said the introductory or the thesis should be at the end of the introductory paragraph. Here's why. You read the introduction of a paper, it builds up to the thesis, but that's maybe half a page. So you have the thesis in your mind as you go. The introduction of a paper doesn't prove the thesis. The body of the paper proves the thesis. How? By proving each supporting point. So each paragraph proves each supporting point. So if you state the argument of the paragraph in its opening sentence, you can then, through the rest of the paragraph, prove your argument. And then that'll make sense. You do that a few times. By the end of the paper, you've proved your thesis. So the reader needs to know what the paragraph is about before they start reading any of your reasoning for your stance. Let's look at an example from the student paper. Now, what is interesting about this movie is how we see a different take on the idea of slavers and their slaves. Again, not worded as clearly as it could be, but the point here is we've got a clear connect to the thesis, and we've got a position. So if you read the student's introductory paragraph, you see that their main point is that the film Django Unchained gives a really unique perspective on slavery. What is one way the film does that? Well, by showing slaves and the relationship to their masters in a very different way. And so you got a clear connection to the thesis, and you got a clear argument position and a clear idea of what this first body paragraph is about. We're going to unpack this more because later in this last part 2-3 of this lesson, we're going to look at how the student proves this particular argument. But first, let's talk about transitions. I've often heard from students that these can be some of the hardest types of sentences to write. So how do you do it? They help readers move from thought to thought, from sentence to sentence, from paragraph to paragraph. Topical transitions. A topical transition, think topic sentence, right? So you're combining topic, sentence, and transition here. Show the relationship between the topic of the previous paragraph and the topic of the current one. So if you've got 3 or 4 supporting points, what is their relationship to each other? If you're doing a rhetorical analysis and you're talking about ethos and then logos, when you get to the logos paragraph, as that's your second paragraph, what's the relationship between the ethos and the logos of this particular text? Let's look how this student does it. So we're going to look at the last sentence in one paragraph and the first sentence in the next paragraph. The creative, emotional aspects of Schultz and Django's relationship, paired with the affirmation of Django's impact on the issues in the movie, make a very believable and sympathetic movie. So the student has done a nice job of concluding this paragraph. They stated clearly that the movie is unique because it shows slaves and slave owners differently than most other films. At the start of the paragraph and at the end, more specific, the slave owner here, Schultz, and the slave, Django, they have this unique relationship, and creativity and emotion have made it unique. And then you've got Django's character is very affirmed, rather than like a stereotype or something condescending about the character who's a slave, the African-American character. This is a very positive, affirming portrayal of the character. And so it makes the movie sympathetic. We're drawn to this appeal of this positive portrayal of an African-American character, but also believable because of the creativity and emotion. So we know what this first paragraph is about, and the writer has wrapped it up nicely with a nice concluding sentence. How does the next paragraph start? Although we see that this film can pinpoint many different emotions, so it's talking about the idea from the previous paragraph, such as empathy or humor, the specific emotions, there is still historical accuracy that further provides background to a film dealing with violent and tough issues. So this is a brilliant transition sentence because the student knows that the kind of relationship Schultz and Django have was not typical, if it existed at all, between slaves and slave owners. Usually, slave owners were very cruel and harsh and awful, and it was a horrible existence to be a slave. So Django's experience with Schultz is not only unique, it may be entirely fictional. But the film pairs that, it's using that kind of idealized relationship that may not even be real for a specific reason the student has talked about in a previous paragraph, and is pairing that with the reality, the historical accuracy of slavery. So later in the movie, we get a much more realistic portrayal of slavery. And it's the combination of those two things that make the movie unique and effective. So we can see here, one paragraph is about emotion, the next paragraph is about historical accuracy, but the student has tied those two together nicely. Finally, we're almost done. I know it's been a longer lecture. Before we move on to my tips for writing, which will be a short end of the lecture, I want to talk about paragraph structure itself, because you've got the intro with the thesis, you've got topical transition sentences at the start of each paragraph. How do you prove your argument within a paragraph? How do you prove that idea from the topic sentence? You'll probably see that in the required reading for today. In addition to the assignment prompt and the sample papers, I posted some outline type handouts of how to structure a paper, how to structure a paragraph. We've been going over how to structure a paper. Here we're going to see how the student structured the paragraph. And there's 4 types of sentences: the topic sentence, a little bit of clarifying background, the evidence, and then most importantly, the analysis of the evidence that proves the topic sentence. And those analytical sentences that come near the end of a paragraph, we call those linking sentences because they connect the topic to the evidence. And then you can usually have a good concluding sentence that wraps everything up, like we saw on the last slide. So here's an example of a topic sentence. It's actually in the middle of a paragraph, but that student's first paragraph probably could have been broken up into 2. But either way, it presents an argument and then proves it. Also, one key point in the movie is a moment of real emotion for Django that's immediately relieved with humor to appeal to both a sincere emotion and comedic emotion. Schultz offers to Django the ability to pick out any costume or outfit he pleases. So the thesis of the paragraph is that at a key moment, the film uses emotion, both sincere emotion to make us sympathetic to the character and comedic emotion to relieve some of the tension of the scene. And that combination of emotions really pulls us into the movie and makes us sympathetic to Django and Schultz. To understand how the film does that, before we get to evidence and analysis, we need a bit of background and context. So Schultz offers to Django the ability to pick out any costume he pleases. But for Django, a slave, we see a real reaction of suspicion, since he's most likely never been offered this by a white man, ever. So in case the reason why this is important or significant, that Schultz lets him pick out his own costume, we need to know that Django as a slave has probably never had this chance before. Now, slavery is fairly common knowledge, so we could assess this out on our own, but this is a good example of a student doing what I mentioned earlier about being very, very clear, right? It's fairly obvious after we read this sentence that Django's never had this opportunity before to pick out his own clothing. But if we are just reading this and the student, say hypothetically, didn't have this second sentence, would we think of that on our own? Maybe. There's a chance, but it's not a given. But the student has had the idea in their head, they've worked it out, now they're telling us their thought process so we can clearly follow their train of thought. That's why making your writing very clear, thinking about your audience, even if it's obvious to you, making it clear to your audience is so important. The evidence is the image. So for those of you who are wondering about how do I incorporate visuals into my paper, you see here that the end of the sentence, the student says, see figure 1, and then the actual analysis is of the image. So rather than a quote, which you could use a quote too if you wanted, but you need to have at least 2 visuals in your paper. You can have more if you want. You analyze the visual, prove your argument. That's what makes it multimodal composition, brings in written and visual analysis. We've been talking about the importance of that the last few lectures. So here's what we call the linking sentence or the analysis. You should usually have a few sentences to do this, more than one, but the student does it really well in this one particular sentence I'm going to quote here. Yet once he's aware that this really is happening, we see that Django takes full advantage of the scenario by acquiring a very flamboyant and outgoing outfit, which is more of an indication to Django's significance in this film. So the student's point is lots of movies throughout history have portrayed African Americans, especially during the time of slavery, in stereotypical, condescending ways. And instead of doing that, this film challenges those stereotypes by making Django this prominent, important, complex, dynamic character. Him wearing this flamboyant outfit that draws attention to itself emphasizes that idea. And so you've got a clear connection between the image, the evidence, and the idea the student's presenting. that the emotions draw us into the film, make us care about Django, and then we see Django prominently displayed when he's given a choice that most slaves were not ever given at that time. Here's, the picture of it. It is an awesome outfit. So hopefully seeing that student paper broken down into pieces like that gives you just a really clear idea of how to do rhetorical analysis and how to incorporate visuals is part of your rhetorical analysis. There's a couple more sample papers on Canvas that you can engage with for the discussion board post. Again, these are not meant to be ideal examples, just illustrations of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about doing rhetorical analysis and writing certain types of sentences. Please reach out to me via email or office hours with any questions at all about how to do the assignment. In real brief, I'm going to give you my tips for writing. And here's a great picture of this movie based on a book called Wonder Boys, where Michael Douglas is an author and Robert Downey Jr., Tony Stark is his publisher, and he's written thousands upon thousands of pages, but they aren't very good. And then he loses them all. The wind blows them away. He wrote them on a typewriter, didn't save them to a computer. But what he learns is that he didn't have any purpose. He wrote for thousands of pages, and he didn't have a purpose of focus. He didn't know why he was doing it other than that he had a first great novel and wanted to write a second novel. So Robert Downey Jr. is trying to chase down the pages, and Michael Douglas learns that to write well, you have to know what you're writing about. You have to have purpose and focus. So hopefully you can find something you're passionate about for the rhetorical analysis, and that would be my first tip. But here are my other ones. Take these with you to other classes, to other writing situations, and you will write well. Start your paper well in advance of the due date, not the night or the hour before. Why? So that you can write multiple drafts. That makes writing a process. Reread your first draft before writing the second draft. Take several days off between finishing the first draft and rereading it. Studies show that if you go and do something else, your mind keeps working on a problem, even if you're not directly focusing on it. So you go to work, you go to sports, you have time with your family, you work on homework for another class. Put the writing assignment out of your mind. When I go back and read things I wrote a month ago or a week ago or a few days ago, I'm shocked sometimes. Did I write that? Did I really say that? Writing is personal. It's hard to be objective about our own writing. That's why we need the help of others, which we'll get to in a minute. But we can be at least a little more objective if we put some distance between ourselves and our writing. So give yourself not only enough time to write multiple drafts, but enough time to take time off and do other things in between reading your drafts. Take a couple of days, do something else, a different type of work, get a good night's rest, wake up with a nice cup of coffee or tea when your mind is fresh and clear, and reread that thing you just wrote. Then, when you've reread it and marked it up and are ready to revise it and write your second draft, make the conclusion to your first draft, the introduction to your second draft. What? What do you mean? Earlier we talked about developing a thesis, and those steps are great. But often to truly know what we're trying to say, to find our purpose, we have to struggle through the agonizing process of writing. And we often find out what we mean, what we want to say by the end of our first draft. So if you take what you've written and put that great idea you have at the end of the paper at the start of your paper, you'll probably have a clear thesis. Then you can revise the rest of your paper accordingly. I can't tell you how many times I've read a student paper and I was so confused. What was the student talking about? Then I got to the end and the conclusion was brilliant. And I said, now I know what this paper is about. How great would this paper be if I'd only known from the beginning what it was about? Once you've got that second draft done, what do you do next? Have others read your second draft before turning it in. So seek the help of others. You'll be doing that in this class via peer review. What else can you do? Visit the Writer Center. As you see on the assignment sheet, I'll actually give you extra credit for that. We have a tremendous Writer Center with professional staff that's incredibly unique at EWU. Take advantage of it. What about beyond EWU? Ask friends, family members, roommates, coworkers, significant others, anybody who you think would do a good job. If you don't think anybody would do a good job, just ask somebody. What's most important is having a second pair of eyes on it. Maybe you think they won't do a good job. Maybe that's perfect. Someone who is not going to be sympathetic to your writing is the kind of reader you want, because you're trying to create change. You're trying to persuade people. If people who know you well and agree with you and kind of understand how you think read your paper, they might not be able to point out the things to you that you need pointed out because, like you, they lack objectivity. My wife is not afraid to be a harsh critic, bless her, but it's hard for her to be one because she knows my mind so well. That's why, I seek out the help of the Writer Center or other people who don't know me so well to read my writing before I turn in important things. Think about audience. Write for readers, not yourself. Truly great writing happens when we make that change. We write something and we don't say, this makes sense. We say, how will someone else react when they read this? How can I adjust it to create the reaction, the change I want them to have? So think about others, not yourself. Thoroughly revise multiple drafts of your paper before submitting the final draft. And that's the writing process. I hope it helps you, not just in this class, but other classes. I very much look forward to reading your papers. Let me know if you have questions.